In adopting rules and guidance that reduces the ability of localities to impose specific franchising requirements, including PEG requirements, on potential new entrants, the FCC appears to have made the decision that in this instance, the goal of reducing barriers to competitive entry outweighs the goal of fostering localism, and where the FCC rules also would reduce or eliminate the ability of localities to impose specific franchising requirements on incumbent cable providers once competitive entry occurs, the FCC appears to have made the decision that in this instance, the goal of creating a level competitive playing field outweighs the goal of fostering localism. While I appreciate all the arguments made in support of promoting competition, as well as those made in support of promoting localism, in my opinion, localism must not be diminished in importance. So I asked the FCC, what are the FCC's views regarding the relative importance of localism with respect to PEG requirements, and have those views evolved in recent months and years?
Well, first of all, I would respectfully disagree with the premise of the question. The 621 franchising orders did not change the ability of the local franchising authority to choose whether or not to require PEG. It didn't change the ability of the local franchising authority to choose how to allocate the revenues they collect. And it didn't change the amount, and the franchising orders didn't change the amount of money that they're allowed to collect from cable operators and their customers. I would respectfully suggest that the balance that's in place was set by Congress. Congress specifically said that the local franchising authorities had to cap the franchise fee at 5%. So that was the maximum amount that they could pass along to cable operators and their customers. What they could charge on top of the 5%, and what's stated explicitly in the statute, is for capital costs related to PEG facilities. If Congress wants to change that balance, I think that's completely appropriate for Congress to do. But what came up in the 621 franchising proceeding were reports from potential new entrants that said they were unable to get a foothold in locations because some local franchising authorities were attempting to collect fees above and beyond the cap set by Congress.
Well, my follow-up to that question was going to be, if Congress were to determine that localism is too important a policy goal to be endangered by state laws that undermine local requirements, what actions do you suggest Congress take in regards to these FCC actions? So in addition to what you spoke about, is there something else that Congress could do to deal with this issue?
Well, I think, if what is resulting isn't consistent with what Congress intended when it set the statute, when it enacted those very specific provisions, I think, Congress can go back to what was in place and allow local franchising authorities to completely cover all the costs of PEG programming, both capital and non-capital costs, above and beyond the 5% that's been set in the statute. So that's something that Congress could do. Congress could, if it believed that the 5% wasn't enough, to charge cable operators and customers, it could increase that amount, or it could, instead of giving local franchising authorities a choice of whether or not to require PEG channels, it could require local franchising authorities to have, some PEG channels.
Cable operators don't complain to the FCC that they're going broke, do they?
I personally haven't heard that complaint.
I suspect you may not. The recent FCC cable franchising orders appear to have thrown into question what payments local franchise authorities may require from cable operators to support PEG services, despite the legislative history of the '84 Cable Act, which indicates that payments for services in addition to facilities and equipment may not be considered part of the franchise fee. The FCC order seems to take a more narrow view of the capital cost that cable operators may be required to pay for PEG support over and above the franchise fee. So for all witnesses, but starting with the so-called PEG advocates, how does the FCC position on capital costs and franchise fees affect the financial resources PEG broadcasters have available? Have broadcasters been forced to cut back on programming because of reductions in financial support?
You can't put cameras in a studio and have no people to operate them. You can't offer a training program and have no one to conduct them. This arbitrary and unreasonable separation of capital and operating costs for PEGs makes no sense, and it never has. And I would agree with Monica Desai that Congress taking a hard look at this unnecessary restriction on capital costs paid above the 5% is something concrete that we would look to Congress to do.
We actually agree with the FCC that the 621 order properly reflects the balance struck by Congress back in 1984. Another personal note, I got on a limb here. And I was senior counsel to the House Telecommunications Subcommittee in 1984 when Congress passed the Cable Act, and this issue was very thoroughly debated. And the compromise, the balance that was reflected in Section 622, very carefully considered. For franchises that were in effect prior to 1984, non-capital costs were not counted against the franchise fee cap. But post-1984, Congress made this distinction between capital costs, which were not subject to the cap, and other contributions to PEG, which would be subject to the cap. Now, let me hasten to add, in the almost 25 years since the enactment of that statute, many cable operators have continued to provide support for PEG, non-capital support for PEG, over and above the cap. But that was the balance that Congress struck.
The FCC order, we believe, too narrowly defines that definition of capital expenses, or what is considered, what is considered appropriate above the 5% franchise fee, and the idea of taking a look at updating the Cable Act with the new Telecommunications Act, and as well as I guess having some of our legal counsel address technical points within the existing Cable Act framework, which does provide and we believe permit there to be above and beyond the 5% support for PEG. So it's I mean, it's important that we not go backward, and I think that I can provide through counsel information regarding some of the technical points and the nuances of that we believe a narrow definition. And I would agree with Monica Desai that perhaps this also is something that we can look at working through our elected leaders.
Thank you. I'm going to recognize Mr. Kirk, and after Mr. Kirk, I would recognize members of the committee in the order that they attended the meeting, and I would remind them not to misbehave like the chairman or the ranking member and stick to the 5-minute rule. Mr. Kirk.